What if I told you that one of the greatest poems in the entire English language is at its heart a brilliant, ruthless, and just surgically precise political attack ad? Well, that's exactly what John Dryden's Absalom and Achitophel is, and today we're going to break down exactly how he pulled it off. So here's the central question, and it is a wild one. It's 1681. England is on the verge of total crisis, and the poet laureate, John Dryden, decides to wade into the fight. But he doesn't just write an essay. Nope. His weapon of choice? A story from the Old Testament. Okay, so let's just crack the code right from the start, because this is the key to the whole thing. Dryden sets up this incredible allegory. The wise, troubled King David, that's really King Charles II. The handsome, super popular but rebellious son Absalom, that's a stand-in for Charles's illegitimate son, the Duke of Monmouth. And the real bad guy, the manipulative advisor Achitophel, well, that's a brutal caricature of the Earl of Shaftesbury, who was the king's #1 political enemy. Now, to really appreciate the genius of this takedown, we have to understand the political firestorm that was raging at the time. This wasn't just some academic debate. This was a fight for the future of the English crown. This timeline really just charts a path straight into chaos. So in 1660, you have the Restoration. King Charles II is back on the throne. Things seem okay. But then, in 1678, the country gets absolutely consumed by the Popish plot, which, by the way, was a totally fabricated conspiracy theory about a Catholic plot to kill the king. This bit of fake news just whipped up this massive anti-Catholic hysteria, which led directly to the main event, the Exclusion Crisis. And at the very heart of this crisis was the king's succession problem. See, King Charles II had no legitimate kids. That meant his legal heir was his brother, James, who was a Catholic. Now, for a fiercely Protestant England, that was a terrifying idea. And to make things even more complicated, Charles had a son he loved, the Duke of Monmouth, who was Protestant and wildly popular, but he was illegitimate. So this is the political showdown that sparked the entire poem. A new political group, the Whig Party, led by that same Earl of Shaftesbury, launched this all-out campaign in Parliament to pass laws that would exclude the Catholic James from ever taking the throne. And who did they want to replace him with? You guessed it, the popular, Protestant, but illegitimate Duke of Monmouth. The country was split right down the middle, and Dryden knew exactly which side he was on. So let's see how Dryden actually built his argument by taking a closer look at how he portrays these three main players in this high-stakes game. All right, first up is King David, who is, of course, King Charles II. Now, Dryden doesn't paint him as some kind of tyrant. No, he's the rightful king ruling by divine right. He's patient, he's merciful, maybe even too forgiving, and he's genuinely troubled by this rebellion brewing. Dryden basically frames him as the one stable, wise leader in a kingdom that's about to spin out of control. Then there's Absalom, the Duke of Monmouth. And Dryden actually treats him with a sort of tragic sympathy. I mean, this guy has it all. He's handsome, he's charismatic, a Protestant hero that the people absolutely adore. But he has a fatal flaw, a deadly combination of ambition and vanity, which makes him the perfect pawn for someone much, much smarter. And here he is, the poem's true villain, Achitophel, the Earl of Shaftesbury. This is where Dryden really sharpens his knives. He's portrayed as this brilliant but totally corrupt schemer who doesn't actually care about religion or what's good for the country. He just sees the chaos, the people's fear, and Absalom's ambition as tools, levers to pull to grab power for himself. So how did Dryden manage to turn what was basically political propaganda into a timeless masterpiece of literature? Well, it all comes down to the art of the takedown. Dryden's weapon of choice was something called verse satire. And you shouldn't think of this as just crude insults. Oh no, it's more like using a literary scalpel instead of a sledgehammer. He uses the most elegant, most polished poetry of the era to just systematically dismantle his opponents with devastatingly sharp wit. And he had this kind of four-part toolkit. First, he used heroic couplets. These are perfectly balanced rhyming lines of verse that make his insults sound incredibly smart and really, really memorable. Second, the biblical allegory, which gave his argument this sense of ancient authority and, a little bit of political cover. Third, he uses razor-sharp irony. And finally, he creates these unforgettable caricatures, basically boiling his enemies down to their single most foolish or dangerous quality. And the effect was just devastating. I mean, listen to these lines that introduce Achitophel. Dryden doesn't just say he disagrees with the guy. He declares him the first among traitors, a name that should be cursed for all of history. That is some serious venom, delivered with absolute poetic grace. So the poem comes out, and it is an absolute sensation, a huge political victory for the king. But the story doesn't stop there. In fact, this is where things take a very strange and chilling turn. When Absalom and Achitophel was published in 1681, it did its job perfectly. It was a propaganda masterpiece. It rallied support for the monarchy, it painted the opposition as these dangerous schemers, and it really helped turn public opinion against the Exclusion Bill. But then, fast forward just 4 years, King Charles II dies, and his Catholic brother James actually does become king. And that's when the poem's allegorical warning became terrifyingly real. In 1685, the real Absalom, the Duke of Monmouth, did exactly what Dryden's poem warned he would do. He let his own ambition, stirred up by his supporters, lead him into an open rebellion to try and take the throne for himself. The rebellion was crushed, and Monmouth was captured and executed for treason. And all of a sudden, Dryden's poem looked less like political satire and more like a prophecy. The tragic path that he had written for his character Absalom, this beloved but misguided man, led to his own ruin by ambition and bad advice. Well, the real Duke of Monmouth followed that script almost perfectly. History ended up validating the poem's core message in the most brutal way imaginable. Which leaves us with this final, fascinating question, right? Was Dryden some kind of prophet? Or was he just such a brilliant observer of people, of politics, that he understood a timeless truth? That ambition, when it's manipulated by others, is an incredibly destructive force that can lead even the most popular people to their own downfall. A lesson that feels just as relevant today as it did back in 1681.